touch.
There. Okay, so I might just repeat for anyone who's streaming in that we won't be able to see questions that you've typed in right away, but that if you actually type them in now, then we will remove the full screen. We'll be able to see any questions you type, and we'll be able to address them. There will be time at the end for questions from anyone who's outside of the room as well as any of you who are inside. So we're starting a little bit late. I'd only planned for about an hour, but it all depends on how much you'd like to talk or what kind of questions you'd like to ask during. I really hope this will be quite interactive. So I'm going to talk a little bit about validity and about conceptions and epistemological foundation of validity, and then talk about theoretical approaches to validation. And then talk about our own research program here at OLBI in language testing services and what we do and our approaches to language validation research and some of the projects we're doing. And then there'll be time. But I have a couple of activities for you to do too, so it's going to be interactive. Some of you will have to talk with your mouth full. Okay, we're all friends here. Okay, so first off, another thing too, sentez-vous à l'aise de poser des questions en français. La présentation va être surtout en anglais, mais j'aime ça l'enfermement. Alors, pendant la présentation, vous allez voir des morceaux en français parce que j'ai pensé en français en premier, alors j'ai mis ça en français. Juste des petits d'ici et là, c'est pas équivalent de loin. Mais si jamais vous avez des questions après aussi, ça me fera plaisir de vous répondre. D'accord? Okay, so what I'd like you to do is look at the following quotes that I'm going to flash up on the next screen. You're going to see the word validity used in 3 different places. And I'd like for you to actually come up with a few synonyms of what you thought validity meant in those sentences, in those quotes. So take maybe 2 minutes to do that with somebody sitting next to you. On a computer form, you have not entered a valid response. In a classroom discussion, that isn't a valid argument. And de ton étudiant, ce test n'est pas valide. Think of a few synonyms. Okay, so I'm hearing a lot of different words coming up. Alors, les synonymes sont valides. So what kind of synonyms, what words did you come up for the first one about the computer form? Did you shout a few? Acceptable. Expected. Expected, yeah. Appropriate. Authorized. Yeah, authorized. Okay, so not anticipated, so like not expected. Yeah, so not an expected format. Anything else? Allowed. Yeah, because clearly if you put in something that's not valid, that's off to you. You can't go any further, right? Not predicted. Yeah. Okay. How about this next one? In a classroom discussion, that isn't a valid argument. It doesn't hold. Doesn't hold water. Doesn't hold up. Yeah. Stand up, hold up. It's not logical. Yeah. It's not logical. Yeah. It's not convincing. It certainly has all connotations here are weakness. It's not certainly not positive. Yeah. Not relevant. Yeah. You get irrelevance or appropriacy. Okay. Okay. What about the last one? Not fair. Certainly. Yeah. Yeah. Well, si un étudiant disait, oui, c'est peut-être. Yeah. Peut-être avec ce sens. Yeah. Yeah. So not fair. Any others for that one for the test? Not reasonable. Justifiable. Lovely. Yeah. Not reasonable. Not fair. Yeah. Yeah. So pas représentatif. Exactly. Exactly. So we've got different sets of words for these three uses of the word valid. You actually came up with fewer for the test one than for the others, which was also interesting. But what is the actual takeaway from this? Certainly that the word used with many different meanings. Absolutely. In the meaning, it seems to refer all the time to some absolute quality of something, right? And certainly there's others that I've already just seen from the nature of your responses now, that the different meanings came up with, you had different sorts of, you had different associations with each different meaning of the word. Yeah, very much. And that the issue of fairness only came up with the testing, right? It didn't come up when you were actually talking about the arguments in class as being valid. But in terms of the use of the word valid, clearly it's a frequent word, and we use it all the time. And we're very comfortable with using it in all these meanings, right? But which is the meaning that we use when we're actually looking at assessment research when we talk about validity? Although I think that you came pretty close in many ways. When you were talking about validity as being something that's representative or reasonable or justifiable, we actually are starting to get at validity in terms of language assessment or in educational measurement or used in some of these academic contexts, right? So let's go to actually the person who's the most cited and most influential in this field in educational measurement as well as in language assessment. And that's Sam Messick, who in 1989 wrote a very seminal work on validity, in which is still being discussed and pulled apart today. And Sam Messick talked about the fact that a test is not valid or an assessment. And when I say assessment, assessment is a broader term. So assessment is anything that's being used to evaluate language. So that includes tests. So that's under the rubric of assessment. But also in assessment, observational judgments are also des évaluations de langue. So you also talk about quizzes, you talk about projects, you talk about oral presentations, you talk about any language that's being used to collect information that you then use to make a decision on. And all of that is part of an assessment, right? And so when I'm talking about validity of assessment, this works for tests, which we do a lot of in language testing services, but it works for any other kind of assessment too. The same properties, the same concepts apply. So whether or not you're a language teacher in the classroom, and you are, I don't know, you've set your students to work on a task, a dialogue that they're doing together. And you walk around the room and you're observing to what extent students are interacting as they're speaking in a dialogue. Then that is an example of you collecting information that you're going to make a decision on later on, whether or not they understood something, whether or not they haven't, and you'll need to cover that again later, whether or not some students need more work. You're making decisions as you're collecting that information, and that's just as much assessment as if when you give someone a test and you get a score. So he talks about validity as not being a property of the assessment. So you never say this is a valid assessment or this is a valid test, actually. You say that it's got to do with the interpretation or the decisions that you make. So it's about the use of it. So one test can be perfectly valid for one purpose and not for another purpose. If you decide to give a spelling test in your French class, because your goal, your objective, is to see whether or not students' spelling is all right on very, very common words, then that's a perfectly acceptable use of that assessment, and so that's a valid use of the assessment for the decision you want to make. If you then take a spelling test and decide you're going to use that to decide the students fail the whole year, that one spelling test, then that is not a valid use of the assessment. There's nothing wrong with the assessment. It's not the assessment's not valid. It's just what the interpretation you're trying to draw from it. And this is one of the biggest things that he drew out when he discussed validity in terms of the components of validity. So he talks about relevance. You brought up relevance. He talks about appropriateness for the use to which it's intended. He also talks about things like the results of an assessment on society, the results of assessment on behavior, the results, the consequences. This is called consequential validity. And really, he looks at what's happening within an assessment and an assessment situation, but then also the effects of the assessment on the broader context. And that's all part of validity. And that's now become something that's been taken wholeheartedly into language assessment from the area of educational measurement. So it really is about confidence. And when you're building a validity argument, as we'll talk about later, it's not about finally figuring out if something's going to be valid, but building more and more confidence that the use you're putting it to or the decision you're making with it is valid. And that's what validity research is, really, in a nutshell. So just, yep, a question. Mm-hmm. La validité, en fait, c'est un niveau de confiance qu'on a dans nos jugements. Yeah. Okay, so epistemologically speaking, okay, so research in validity, like me, like Amelia over there, like anyone who's doing work in language assessment, because we talk about, in language assessment, we talk about doing validity work and we talk about doing research and validation, but there's really no two things. The research is validation. All research we do in language assessment is validation research, right? And so we actually look at the relationship between the assessments, or we look at the relationship between the score and what we're actually assessing. Now, Carol Chappell has talked a lot about this, and she's talked about how, what do we actually mean? Like, what does a score actually mean? What does the result of the assessment actually mean? Does it mean what level they are? Have we established a continuum of development? Well, researchers in SLA might disagree with this. But in this continuum, is an assessment able to place someone on a certain level of a continuum? Does it show how much or how little of an ability someone has? Or of a construct, the amount of a construct that somebody has? And I want to follow up with this idea of construct. So, very visual, and I like looking at construct as sort of this circle. And the construct, or le construit en français, if we say that the construct, what it is we're attempting to capture, not measure, because maybe we're not using numerical terms, but we're trying to capture a construct, right? We have to define it in some way that we all agree. And we could call our construct, for example, language proficiency for university success. This is one we're quite interested in our own context. And so if that's our construct, then we'll do an assessment, or on fait une évaluation qui ça prend comme un échantillon du construit. Si c'est bien construit, c'est ça ce que l'évaluation va faire. So the assessment will capture a teensy bit of the information of the construct. It will address the construct in some way. So that means the score will give us a little bit of information towards the construct. So the score is not, but we know that intuitively anyways. Still though, it's not odd for someone to say, to come up to me sort of on a weekly basis and say, well, you know, I've got these group of students and they did the test and they did well on the test and then they went into my class and they still can't do such and such or do such and such. And I'll say, yes, and? Because I know that the test is only one little piece. So it gives us a little bit of information about the construct. So we want to be confident that somebody knows the construct. So what do we need to be more and more confident, or confident enough that we can make our decision that they have a certain amount of the construct? Well, there's lots of things we can do. We can take more pieces, so we can do more assessments, take more bites out of this, right? Although at a certain point, you have to stop. You know, you run out of time, you run out of money, or sometimes maybe the evaluations you're taking are taking the same little bite every single time and you're not getting any new information. And so, but that's good though. You know that you have to take a certain amount of information before you make a decision. And so that's one way you can do it. Or what you do is assessment, you take a test and then you combine it with other types of information. That's also assessment. And with all that information together, you can make, with stronger confidence, this decision. You see with these small circles that there's actually a lot of space that's outside the construct too, right? And that's done on purpose because when you see a score on an assessment, does that score represent only their language proficiency for success? What other stuff is going on in that score? There are other things that are not related to the construct that are represented in the score. Of course, these are called construct irrelevant factors or construct irrelevant variance in the scoring. And we try to reduce that as much as we can. Like, for example, if you're giving a test in your class, you make sure to space people out because you don't want the score on the test to be mainly a result of how well they could see on each other's papers when they were doing the test. Because cheating is a construct irrelevant factor, right? Or even other ambient conditions like the amount of noise or how hot it was. Can you think of any other construct irrelevant factors that take place when you're assessing? This noisy information, the information that's not related to the construct, but it's, you know, it's there in the score.
What time of the day?
The time of the day, yeah.
Yes. I can give you an example. For us, we're told that some students get really stressed because it's time, and you cannot go back to review a past question.
Yeah.
So someone who is used to flipping back and forth and doesn't have the same skills that are used in this particular test is going to be at risk.
Yeah, you've actually captured a couple things there.
Oh,
You captured the form of the task might actually have affected the score, and the anxiety of the test taker could have affected the score. Yeah.
Individual, basically.
Yeah, there's individual factors.
If you're sick, you're depressed, or you're hungry, or you're hot or cold, or whatever, but you cannot control for those factors.
Yeah, there's some things you can control for, like the cheating. There's some things you can't control for. So it's once you start actually thinking about all the things that can affect the score, you can see why most of it is outside the construct, not the other way around. So that's how I like to sort of interpret the construct. And in terms of how we define the construct, we've been affected, just like all areas of the social sciences, in moving away from a more positivistic approach to a more social constructivist approach in how we view language assessment, just like how we view language teaching. And so if you take more of a realist perspective, you talk about language proficiency as some actual thing that exists. It's just there, and we need to get at it. And we need to make the best tool to get at it the best. And so that means that validity is, well, we show how we're eliminating all of our bias to actually get at the truth. We want to have more confidence in our decision by eliminating bias. So validity is interpreted differently here. And also validation, the whole process of validation is gone at very differently. And traditionally this was done psychometrically. It was done really through statistics and through quantitative research. And in this approach, which was really the beginning of language assessment, the role of people besides language assessment specialists is not really valued. Like teachers, expert judgment, the raters, they're just seen as sources of potential error or bias, really, in getting at the truth. And they need to be mitigated, right? And so it's a very different approach in terms of the relative value of other stakeholders in the assessment process. So if we go to the constructivist side, which is really what's most dominant now, is the idea is that like something like language proficiency for university study, there isn't that one thing that exists. Really, it's defined and it's defined a million different ways by different people. We come to a common definition of it. So when we actually make an assessment, that's the first thing we need to do is come to some kind of explicit common understanding of what the construct is, because it's not just something that everyone's going to know. It's just out there. So it's socially determined and it varies. And so validation is about collecting evidence, still collecting evidence, but it's about building arguments to build confidence in the decisions we make. And with this, some of the evidence can come from teachers, can come from raters, can come from expert opinion. And that actually helps us in building our arguments. Another way that we build our arguments is through theory, but then we also collect hard evidence on the tests themselves and how they're functioning. And we even, in this case, can collect information from the test takers themselves. Like if we are interested in figuring out how much anxiety is being generated by a test, because we're worried that that's generating a lot of construct or relevant variance in our scores, well, the best thing to do is to just ask the test takers. So that wasn't something that was traditionally even seen as useful, and now it absolutely is. Okay, so the validation process. Kane talks about this in probably a more coherent way than I'm able to do it, and so here he is. He talks about it as an evaluation of the plausibility and appropriateness of the proposed interpretations and uses of test scores. It's about building a case, really, and defending that case, justifying it. And that it's an ongoing process. It's not like validated test, it's all done. That never happens. It never happens because test takers change. Our idea of what the construct changes all the time. New theory comes up. We have other areas of research that start informing what we actually understand about language and what quality language is. And once we change that, then all of the assessment of it needs to change. So it's really, it's constantly moving. Okay, so there are theoretical frameworks for language test validation, just really specifically. And they're sort of, they've broken themselves into two sort of camps, and one's more European and one is more North American, but we get along very well and we go to the same conferences and everything's fine. In fact, there's a lot of similarities between them. It really is about arguments and evidence. So Lyle Bachman started in the 90s in looking at Toulmin-style argumentation for building an assessment use argument, is what he called. This is a very formalized, systematic way of arguing for the appropriate uses of a language assessment. And it is being used, it's affected a lot of large-scale test development, like the TOEFL has an entire book that is, it's assessment use argument for the TOEFL, the large-scale tests. And so what it is, the Toulmin style, what I mean by that is that you have a chain of inferences that are made, and you make a claim, say, about the content of the test. And then from that claim, you have warrants and backing to back up that claim. And that's done at every stage of interpretation of the process of a test being delivered and then scored, and then the actual reporting of the scores and the uses of the test score. And so if you actually look at visual representations of these assessment use arguments, you kind of want to go home and pull the covers over your head. But Weir has done something which is a little bit less imposing. And what he's done is he's done a sociocultural model for evidence-based test validation, which actually captures a lot of the same components. And so there's a lot to be learned from both of these things. Certainly the two components are there. You're making an argument. That argument is based on evidence and it's based on argument, logical argumentation through theory. And you're making claims, and you have to support and back up all the claims that you're making. An interesting thing about Weir is he actually starts even before the test is actually developed in looking at evidence and assumption. Okay, so Kane tries to explain the interpretive argument this way. The chain of inferences that link the assumptions leading to assessment design and the evidence that supports the plausibility of the conclusions drawn from the results of the assessment. Okay, so instead of trying to parse this, I thought it would be much easier to actually work through an example, to actually give you a test, and then we actually look at all the places where you would have to collect evidence and make claims. So I started with sort of a simple type of test. You see that simple can get complex really fast, but Kane actually recommends that what you do is you start, it's like a backwards design, like for lesson planning for backwards design. You actually start with the decision you want to make. It's best to be thinking about this whole thing as you're developing a test or an assessment. Now, I'll show you about how you do this all the time as a teacher in the classroom, but you don't have to do it in such highly formalized or explicit to other people process. You're doing it subconsciously, unconsciously, you're doing it constantly as teachers. So we'll talk about that later. But we'll talk about maybe sort of a more formal test now and go through all of the steps. But you start with your decision and then you work backwards. Well, what kind of assessment would help collect information on that decision I want to make, right? So if the decision is, you must decide if a person has the language ability to successfully order food in a restaurant. So that's your construct, so that's a big circle. Being able to successfully order food in a restaurant, right? So for the assessment, you have decided you need to take a person to a restaurant and have them order food. So it's essentially a performance assessment. You could have decided something else, like you're going to have in the classroom, you're going to pretend to have assessment. Okay? And then your conclusion, so when you start to make an interpretation towards your decision, if they get the food they ordered twice, we can conclude that they can successfully order food in the restaurant. So there you are, you've got the decision, the assessment, how you're going to get from the assessment to the decision making. That's a whole chain of inferences. And if you want to actually defend all this, which is what validation is, then you're going to have to provide evidence and arguments in all these different places. Like, what does successfully mean? Like, why this assessment and not another assessment? Like, why twice? Etc., etc. So let's break them down one at a time. So what does it mean to be successful? And I've got it here, we've kind of defined it as just getting your food as being successful. But also maybe not insulting the waiter would probably be more successful. If you get your food, but you've insulted the waiter in the process, that wouldn't be considered a successful restaurant ordering experience. Can you think of anything else that would mean that you've been successful in doing this?
You're probably efficient at doing it, so it doesn't take you half a day to get to your request.
Yeah, that's right. Efficiency, the time it takes you would be maybe part of the construct. Yeah, exactly. Anything else? Yeah. That's right, yeah. Independently, which is also, something that we can add. If we were defining our construct, which would be the first step, you can see that it starts to get really big really fast. And this is only a teensy little assessment, right? Anything else you can think of off the top of your head?
Well, they say, I want stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to get the food.
Right.
But that's not your language.
And it's efficient, but that's right, yeah. But I guess you need effective use of nonverbal strategies, but certainly you need to use your words too. I don't even know how to say that exactly.
How did you arrive at getting the food? Was it sociolinguistically appropriate the way you asked? Bring me this food.
That's right.
You get your food, but it's very rude.
That's right. But did somebody spit in it before they gave it to you?
Yeah, what you get if you order like that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
What we were talking about this morning with Amelia and Carla, interactional competence. Do you exhibit that?
And that's right, and that's exactly validation work that Amelia and Carla have been doing, because they've seen in the field, they've seen that there's more and more attention paid to interactive competence, and yet it's not being captured like it should be in rating scales. So how can we improve? And so the validation work is what we started with today. Yeah. So that's it. So we have to clearly define this construct. And then as soon as we've done that, of course, the assessment becomes much simpler and easier to defend, right? Because if you haven't actually done that first step, then how can you then make the argument that your assessment is capturing that construct, right? So, and you talk about characteristics of successful performance in the target domain, which is how Bachman would put it. Then we go to the second part, to the development of the actual assessment. So say you take the person out to a restaurant and have them order food, so a performance assessment. So you would have to justify why you did this, because that's less practical than having them do it in a role play in class. Yeah, and more expensive. So you'd have to justify why this would be preferable to some other more practical sort of measure. You'd have to ask, well, couldn't they just tell me what they would have done? Do I have to actually watch them do it to know? So you actually justify that, and that can be justified theoretically or through empirical research, right? And so if we've defined success as being able to order, for example, a variety of different food, because if being able to order only coffee is not just success, right? If it's a variety of different food, then in the assessment, how much different types of food should they be ordering in the assessment to actually match the success? So you're going back to the construct, right? So those are the kind of things you have to think about in that step. And then when you get to the conclusion, the actual, really this is, I'm saying the conclusion, but this is the moment when scoring takes place and then when score decisions are being taken. We can say something gets a 1 to a 5, but which one of those levels is the minimum acceptable performance? Which one is a pass? Which one's a fail? You know, what are the characteristics? And then leading to what the decision is made. Right? And so, if they get the food they ordered twice, why twice? You know, why not 3 times? Why not once? We want to be parsimonious as well, right? If we get the same amount of information once as we do twice, it'd be better to do it once. So we need to find the minimum amount of information we collect until we get to the decision that's acceptable to us.
And it's quite comparable, because if the first case is a coffee and the second one is a complex full meal, then they're not comparable twice.
Yeah, and as soon as you get multiples of anything in assessment, you think about whether or not they're equivalent to each other.
You often said it.
I'm just talking about food in a restaurant. We'll talk about much higher stakes in a minute, but okay. So let's get back to how you are doing this all the time if you're a language teacher in a classroom. So what you're doing is you're deciding how much of a sample you take of students' language before you make a decision. You're doing that all the time. Sometimes you have practical concerns, like report cards are due in 2 weeks, right? And so you are constrained by that practical sort of constraint. And so how much information can you collect before that grade on the report card is not just pulled out of the air, actually is representative of what they're actually doing, right? So you're making this decision all the time. You're actually deciding, you've got your own ideas as experts in language on what it means to know a language or what quality language is. So you're getting your students to do things in class that you feel will develop their language. And it's not just intuition. You're basing that on experience. You're basing it on years of training. You're basing it on the literature that you're familiar with. So all of that comes in, and which means you're making interpretive arguments in your head. You're making these justifications for why you're doing this activity, why you're doing a role play, and why not some other activity. And that role play, it's an activity, it's teaching, but it's also assessment. There's no difference, because that's giving you the information you need to keep going in your lesson. OK, alors lorsque les enjeux sont plus importants, on voit qu'on peut, chaque moment où il faut prendre une décision, ou chaque moment où on doit justifier sa décision, ça prend de plus en plus de l'ampleur. Hein? Alors, ça devient, on est obligé d'être plus systématique, plus explicite. Et on a ce droit, cette responsabilité. So, validity studies. Let's think about validity studies we could carry out or could have carried out when we're doing the restaurant thing again. So, we're collecting evidence for all these assumptions we're making. So, if we had said, okay, we've defined success as not insulting the waiter. Well, we didn't just come up with that out of our heads. What we actually did was, we did a validation study. It's called a priori validation, according to Weir, which is during the development, before you've even administered, you're actually trying to figure out how to capture the construct. So you actually surveyed language people, restaurant people, and said, what do you think success is, successful ordering in the restaurant is? And they just asked a bunch of people. And so you found that doing it without insulting the waiter came up all the time. And so you use that expert judgment as a way of making the decision. So when somebody asks you, the test developer, why not insulting the waiter? Why is that part of it? You'll say, well, because we did this research. We justified that it's commonly held belief that this is part of successful restaurant ordering. And so we backed it up. Sometimes it's from empirical research like that. Sometimes it's from theory, from theoretical understandings in the field that we can make this justification. We do not have to go out and do a study anymore to say that people get anxious in test-taking situations. This is commonly known in the field that language testing anxiety is a thing that exists and it affects test scores. We don't have to go do a study for that. We have to do a study to find out to what extent it's affecting your test. But we know, from theoretically speaking, we know that it's something that exists, right? And so here's another one. So I said, we're going to make a claim that 2 restaurants is enough to be confident in our decision making. Can you think of anything we could do to back that up? What kind of validation evidence we could use for the claim that 2 restaurants is enough? Yeah?
It has with 1 restaurant, it has with 2 restaurants, and it has with 3 restaurants.
Yeah?
And he gets the results are the same, different, and where there's
I'm thinking like a language tester. Yeah. Yeah. Are we getting more really useful information with 3, or what? Are we sufficiently confident with 2? And so yeah. So that's one way that we could do that. And so then that twice is something that can be justified, because people look at every single piece and will say, why this piece? And for each one of those pieces, we need to have the argument for it, or we need to collect the evidence. So you see, there's no stop, like there's never an end to it. There's always pieces that haven't been explored enough, or that have changed and we need to look at again, or that we haven't looked at in a while, so we need to look at again. Exactly. So you're always balancing that. The validity and the practicality are always pulling against each other. Always. It's like a zero-sum game. The more confident you are in your decisions means the more information you're collecting. The more information you're collecting, the less practical.
Of course, you can go on and collect information.
Exactly.
40 students, and you take this to 3 restaurants each.
Yeah, exactly. It starts to get expensive besides other things.
For the professor.
And you start to gain a little weight. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And so what happens is that teachers, testers, everybody collects information to the extent that they possibly can, in the most efficient way they can, until they can make their decisions and sleep at night, basically, right? And that's at the point at which you stop. Yeah, exactly. Okay, so in terms of evidence, I already started talking to you about the type of studies we could do. So you see the type of evidence we collect is really varied. It used to be that language assessment attracted people who were just really into statistics, because language assessment research was about running stats. Because statistical information can be very useful for evidence in language testing validation research. But now it's attracting all sorts of people, because validation study can be an ethnographic study of what's happening for people who were taking testing accommodations, all the way to inferential statistics, where you're comparing the equivalency of different test versions across thousands of test takers. I'm currently doing a narrative inquiry of an Aboriginal woman doing First Nations immersion education in her kindergarten classroom. And all of it is language assessment research. So it's varied. Now we're starting to attract people from all over the place. But there still, of course, is this general association of stats with language testing research. And I don't want to minimize the fact that that's still very, very useful as a source of evidence. But so you get statistical analysis, you get expert opinion, which means teachers. It means people who know the students and students' performance. If you're developing a test of language for nurses, do you know what you need to develop that test? Nurses. Yeah. And so we have people who are experts in fields for English for specific purposes. They need to be involved in test validation.
Yeah. Number one, reliability.
Yes, but that's a good question. Reliability is like consistency, right? It's about scoring if you're scoring consistently. Yeah, if you're consistent internally from one time to the next, for example, or if two people are consistent with each other. Yep. And this is seen as subsumed within validity, because if you're not being consistent, then you can't make valid interpretations. In fact, Weir, the second guy I was telling you about with the theoretical framework, he calls reliability scoring validity. He calls it like, yeah. And so it's really, certainly something being reliable isn't enough to make valid interpretations, but it's a necessary quality. The score, you have to know that the score has been consistent to do anything else, really. But well, if we go back to the example of a spelling test being used to decide if someone passes or fails a course, I bet you could score that spelling test very reliably. Everyone could score it exactly the same. It would be a very reliable test. But the validity argument would be very difficult to make for that purpose.
I'm sorry, this may be very naive, but referring back to a master's course that I took almost 10 years ago, and we talked about validity and reliability as quite separate constructs, and then so sometimes there would be low validity but high reliability, or vice versa. And now this is somewhat new to me, that validity, and it makes sense, that validity encompasses reliability, but could there be a situation in which we would have high validity but low reliability?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good question. People still just talk about reliability and validity like they're two separate things. But the fact is that they're so important to each other. We know that if you don't have reliability, then you can't make any valid interpretation. So it's a necessary requirement for any valid decision making. So you see how close they are. But yes, what can happen, the same thing with how validity is always pulling against practicality, it often pulls against reliability as well. I'll give you an example of what you're asking for. If you actually have a really complex project that you've developed in your class, where, I don't know, students have to build a model and make a presentation, and it's done with a high degree of detail. So after it's done, I mean, when someone does a really good job on this project, a great presentation, a fantastic project, a beautiful model, then you can say with a great deal of confidence whether someone has really understood the material or has applied the concepts. So you feel confident in the decision making. But say you wanted to give it a score and another teacher wanted to give it a score. How close would your scores be on something that's so complex? So as soon as assessments get really complex, anything that requires sort of a subjective judgment, even essays, you know that you're different your score compared to someone else. But it can be a more valid way of finding out certain amounts of information. Yeah.
You can have a very valid test, but
Not a valid
If
test.
you haven't trained, you
Valid.
realize that your raters, and if they use different criteria for judging the task, then it's
Yeah.
not reliable.
Yeah, and they could
Valid,
both
but
say
it's
that
not
it was very
reliable.
good, but then if you asked them if it was very good, they'd be talking about completely different criteria for why it was good.
Different criteria for
Yeah.
judgment.
So that there are challenges, as soon as you try to make something really, really complex, meaning cover as much, if you've got a really complicated construct, then you need a complex assessment to get at it, and it makes challenges for reliability, for getting everyone to agree what the passing would be on something like that, for example.
So then I guess I see it also as compromising validity.
Yeah,
So it seems
Yeah.
like it's a bit of a, I don't want to call it a vicious circle,
No.
but it seems like it's
I'm so, I think probably every other talk I give, I've got this visual I put up, and I don't even have it this time, I'm so surprised. But I've got validity as it's a Venn diagram, validity, reliability, and practicality, all three of them, and all pulling against each other. It's exactly how I see it too. And so you're aiming for that middle, so that it's practically you can do it, because if practically you can't do it, then you can just give up. Reliability, you need to control that to the extent that the scores you give are not mostly dependent on the person happening to score it. So you're controlling that as much as you can. And then in validity, so that you're capturing enough of the construct. So you can reduce the construct and say, good writing is just good spelling. And then it's really reliable. But darn it, the construct is not. You're getting like a tiny piece of the construct. Yeah, they're always pulling against each other. Yeah. What's super practical and super reliable usually doesn't tell you much. Yeah. And this is why you have to balance when you're assessing, you have to balance sort of objective items, true and false and multiple choice. They're very reliable. You have to balance those with like projects and essays and larger things. And if you balance those and collect this variety of information, you're playing off all the reliability and validity issues, challenges with each of them. Any other questions about that, about the evidence that's collected? So really, you can use your imagination. There's more and more different types of evidence that's being collected now from different people who are involved in the process. You see why I like it so much, huh? You see why it's so fun? Okay, so here's another decision. I decided I'd just throw up one here that's a little bit higher stakes.
Yeah.
so far, though.
You must decide if a professor has passive or receptive proficiency in the language sufficient to fully participate at the University of Ottawa. Pour déterminer son niveau de compétence et pour garder son emploi, le prof doit réussir un test de langue. So the complex construct. And I couldn't help but think of this as an example because Amelia and I are actually working on this particular test right now. We're doing some validity work. We're revising the test. We're making some new changes based on new things that we're learning in the literature. And so it's in my head all the time right now. And the stakes are really high. And so first off, you get the construct, right? Passive language use or receptive, sufficient to succeed or fully participate at the university. So already, how many conversations would you have to come up with a common definition of this construct? Yeah, exactly. It's just every word's another minefield.
It's the word.
Yeah, exactly.
Definitely, even the word professor, because you're 10 faculty.
Yeah, that's right. And we know that different faculties have different interpretations of this construct. Yeah. So we have to figure out a construct definition that would be acceptable to the union involved and to the faculties involved, to the professors, yeah, to the deans of the faculties.
Background question, you actually are thinking of a test that will measure this instead of leaving it in the hands of the dean.
Professors, we have a test for this already. We test professors for this at language testing services. But we actually are looking at adding some tasks to this test and making revisions to the test. So because it's time to revise it, and because we've been, like recently I've been reading a lot in another literature that's very recent in the area of translanguaging. Now, we know very much that our meetings often alternate between multiple languages. So if you have receptive language skills, I think part of the construct, and you have to defend this through argumentation, through this, right? Part of the construct could arguably be, if you're at a meeting that's going on, Amelia, you can jump in at any time. If you're at a meeting that's going on in English and French, then part of your passive ability would be, well, I wouldn't have to speak French myself, but I'd have to understand the French bits. Right? Yeah, which means that if, for example, during the meeting, if someone asked me to do something in one of the French bits, I'd know that I would need to do it. That I would actually be responsible for everything happening in the meeting, even the French bits. And so you see, at the University of Ottawa, many things happen completely bilingually. So, as for example, a lot of documentation is both, right? But at a meeting, you're not getting repetition. You're getting maybe follow-up in another language. You're getting instructions in another language. But we know that the meeting is probably not taking place exclusively in that language. That you would be able to produce English, I'm saying English, but it could be the opposite, right? In a meeting that's mostly happening in English, you're speaking French, but you would need to understand all the English parts. And that could be part of the definition of being able to fully participate or function. But that's an argument that needs to be made, right? And that's part of our very unique situation here. Now, can you think of any other complicating factors when you think about this? What we need to capture in an assessment?
I think each word has lots of different dimensions, but participate at what level?
Yeah.
Is it meeting level or teaching in that language, or what kind of participation do you anticipate?
Well, actually, that's sort of been, in terms of the collective agreement, passive or receptive, we know, you don't have to teach in the other language.
No, that's
Yeah.
what I know, but I mean, because different faculties have different requirements. And if a professor is supposed to be able to teach in that language, then you have to have a different.
That's right. So this construct is just the passive receptive one.
Yeah.
And we've got a passive receptive test too. And then we've got the productive
Yes,
one
yes.
where they're speaking and writing. Yeah, Jennifer? Yeah.
I think the word fully participate can also include confidence. That if someone feels that they are confident to attend a particular meeting or to volunteer to participate in a particular committee, then that they have to have confidence in their language, because otherwise they will not step up to the plate to do it.
So do you feel like sort of a report by the professor on their perceived confidence of their ability to do different tasks should be part of the assessment?
Maybe. But it's not a part of the construct of competence.
Oh, it might,
might.
yeah, that's a matter for argument. Yeah. It is, yeah. Because we know that language ability, we know that these individual psychological factors do impact our language ability, right?
Yeah. But you can probably include the fact of appropriately report about something in your own language and appropriately react to whatever is being said.
Mm-hmm.
That means that if you said that, yes, the best is on fire, you probably, the professor does not need to speak, but he needs to get some water. It's English get out.
Yeah.
So that would mean he understood. So the reaction or whatever you can say in his own language and say, okay, say to someone else in English, okay, please apply it somewhere. He understood. And maybe part of a sub-definition of participation.
That's right, yeah. Yeah, Lise?
I agree with Jennifer that the person fully participated is very charged.
Yeah.
And one element that I'm aware of.
And maybe we should just get rid of it altogether.
Clarify it.
Yeah.
The element of autonomy, and that could be with the level of services that are provided to help the confidence and the initiative in the person. For instance, do we have staff who can translate their material that they can then present by reading it, instead of having a spontaneous intervention that requires a lot more background competence.
So you can see that having a really clear definition of the construct that everybody knows and that's out there and that everyone's aware of would be helpful, and it would impact resources, it would impact how professors prepare for the test, all these sorts of things. But that getting just past this, and when it comes to a very high stakes test or a very politically charged test, you see that even getting past this first stage is very problematic. That interesting?
I think I understand it passive proficiency and receptive proficiency.
It's kind of the same, yeah.
But I find that receptive proficiency has a more a positive.
That's what we use in the paper.
Yeah.
Yeah. They're both, yeah, they're both inherently problematic though, because we certainly know that the passive skills are actually very active, right? They're just happening in our brain where we can't see them.
Processing.
Yeah, exactly.
Understanding.
Yeah, and receptive is, it's kind of like the blank, the empty vessel sort of thing, yeah. Yeah.
Still processing.
So both of them are not great.
Yes.
I put them both and didn't like either one of them, but, yeah.
So it's very interesting for me because I keep so oftentimes I keep trying to think about validity and reliability. Oftentimes for high stakes we want to have high degree of reliability. The easiest way to test this would be, and I have passed this test, so I can talk about it. So a very reliable way of testing this would be a listening comprehension multiple choice, right? However, then when you read the definition of participate fully in activities, it is very different from listening to a recorded, non-interactive speech sample and then trying to, focus on some details, focus on some general ideas, and then memorize them and then answer. And so, I guess people would like to have reliability both from the point of view of the professor, knowing how they will objectively and fairly mark, because it's, it's okay, I know I missed a few questions, right? And also from the point of view of the test provider. However, I guess it's a good thing you guys are redesigning this because I guess an interaction, and it's so nice to come back to the thing that were mentioned this morning, some interactive aspects of it, even though it's receptive or passive, would be very appropriate. Would increase the validity, I guess.
Yeah,
Does that make sense?
that's very well put, yeah. And it used to be that back in the day, back in the old psychometric heyday, it didn't really matter how authentic something was. As long as you could say that, well, whatever I get you to do, even if it's not like what you would do in the actual situation, it's that statistically we can predict from that score what you would do in that situation, then that's good enough. And so, and it's true that the language, the listening test for the professors is fine in that you're able to predict with a reasonable degree of certainty, but at the same time, it doesn't actually represent what you're doing, so it doesn't have, there's the statistical argument that you're making, but not the authenticity argument, right? And when it comes to, and you talked about reliability, it would be more reliable to grade what you're talking about than the kind of task that we're trying to come up with. We're going to have to try to figure out a way to mitigate against potential problems with reliability. And so we're playing all these things off. But I want to come back to what Jennifer was saying, because I think it's really useful to think of a person, their report on how confident they feel, I think probably would play a lot into the construct. However, when it's for a high stakes decision, they're deciding whether or not someone gets promotion or tenure, are they going to let the professor judgment on their ability play into that decision? Even though, in terms of increasing the validity argument, it would.
Yes.
It would make us more confident. But it needs to be seen as objective.
Yes.
Another word that's not used the same way in assessment, but arm's length and all that. Disinterested. And so then we have to go against validity because of these other political concerns.
It also seems to me that your assessment wants to be it's reliable. And to be able to predict the maintenance of the content, because that's one of the problems I would have crossed in other situations. That once they get the test and do the test, then that's not sustained, that's not maintained. So I don't know if there's a way of getting around this by manipulating what you're doing with the assessment.
Oh,
See, that's super interesting.
Yeah.
The public service does this, where they have based it, they have a level where they assume, look at the crystal ball, is this sustainable? They have a level C, and they have a level X where they
which
say,
is why I kind of.
level X is just a level C that we think will be sustained.
Right.
So when we talk about the impact of that, that's a really huge.
3 minutes.
impact that I'm looking into this crystal ball and I'm gonna predict.
Yeah.
Like, no way, like you're getting into super dangerous waters there by saying, I'm looking at what I have here today and I'm gonna use my seer ability to say, yeah, they're gonna be able to keep that up in 5
Yeah.
years.
Think of the other way though. There are people who can be disconnected from the language and can pick it up. You
Yeah.
still pick it up.
But as far as I know, there's no test that's predicting that very well. Yeah.
But you are not
That's-
testing that. You are saying based on the competence we have measured now, we can predict this person can perform reasonably well. But whether they retain that information and skill or not is up in your hands.
Only if the test, the only way to do that is if the test included what Jennifer suggested. And you actually ask the test takers their intentions to continue with the language, you knew about their language use outside the classroom, you collected all this information that we know has an impact on maintenance of the language. But a language test, like the typical language tests that you're seeing, are not very useful for predicting later maintenance of the language. It's another type of information we need
Control
for
their
that.
behavior, you cannot make that a part of your assessment.
But you're saying.
Okay, I'm gonna have
But
to,
the research we could do is
so happy.
identify.
But that's not what I'm saying.
Okay.
What I'm saying is that the problem is to try to find what would be the characteristic of the learner. Okay, that would retain a language even though being disconnected, more or less disconnected from it.
yeah,
And so what you try to find are those learners that are at that point. You try to assess their characteristics, how they've been learning the language, and then try to assess the newcomers, the new learners, in terms of those specific characteristics.
I think probably the same tool you would use for figuring out what those characteristics are, you would have to continue using for future learners. I don't know if that could be translated into some other type of task, but it's a fascinating question. But, okay, so moving on. So, yeah, so we've already covered all of these decisions. So I just wanted to quickly read our approach to language test validation and language testing services. And this will all completely ring completely true and completely logically to now, right? So just word for word, test validation work requires a systematic and transparent approach to questioning and reflecting on language test constructs as they're represented by our testing activities. Quality test validation work must be ongoing and recursive. Test validation work must be situated within a clearly articulated theoretical base, one that acknowledges psychological as well as social aspects of the target language domain and its related test construct. We acknowledge the value of several existing models and view them as complementary, not mutually exclusive. Yep. Always going back, always going back. Yeah.
Questioning your previous decisions.
That's right. And yet, and then, so not linear. Yeah. So a later move will affect a previous one. Yeah. Test validation work must also demonstrate a preoccupation with critical issues, such as examining the consequences of the test we use, protecting the rights of test takers, and incorporating multiple test stakeholder contributions. Because the complexity of test validation work is outlined above, this work necessitates the collection of both quantitative and qualitative data, either separately or within mixed methods inquiry. So this last February, we sat down language testing services and we articulated our approach to language assessment validation. And you can see from what I presented earlier today where we've come up with in that statement. So actually you see that we work in language just sort of as a final note. I just wanted to talk about the place of language testing, the whole language assessment sector within OLBI, and the fact that we really need to work with everybody else in all the other areas of OLBI to be successful in our own job. We're not just off in a corner somewhere doing our own little thing. And we don't need you don't have to say, oh, I'm not a testing expert. Because as you see, we need lots of different types of expertise to do this, not just language testing expertise. We need people to pilot assessments and help us to judge whether or not they're useful. We need people to actually judge authenticity. If we're trying to create something authentic, then we need judgments of whether or not we've actually succeeded in doing so. We need people to actually help us with that very first big piece of defining the construct to begin with. And you don't want to just leave that in the hands of language testers to do that. You want people with a wide variety of expertise in all areas of language to develop the constructs. It makes it harder on language testers to develop the tests or the assessments afterwards, but that's all right. That's our problem. So you see that c'est vraiment une affaire de tous. So I'm going to stop there and see if you have any questions. So how do I stop it from being full screen so I can see if there were any questions from?
Do you know, Jeremy? There's the full screen button is there.
Right beside.
One beside
Beside.
that.
Yeah, click that. There we go.
Oh, there we go. So we have questions?
No questions, I don't think.
Okay.
Anybody there at all?
Yeah, Sarah said that she couldn't hear, and then of course we turned on the speaker, and that helped. But if you want to bring in any questions now, Sarah, you can. And if you have any questions. Oh, Mélanie. Oh, déjà la rétroaction. So we've been asking questions all the way along, but I'm wondering if there's anything else that's been nagging at you. I'm that good. Well, thank you very much. Thanks a lot for coming. Thank you.
Just officially, Beverly, I'd like to thank you for the presentation. We have a small gift.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for
Very
interesting.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Very helpful.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks. I was happy to share all with you.
I'm so glad that everybody heard you. It was great.
Okay, I'm gonna turn that